Welcome. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Family Links. Let's see. My name is Colleen Kenny. I am a parent consultant with Utah Family Voices, which is a project within the Utah Family Center, within the Utah Parent Center. Our session is not very long this morning, and it's going to unfortunately end probably, before we know it. I'm going to announce when we have about 20 minutes left before the session's complete. And then our wonderful presenter will have about an additional 10 minutes to wrap up. And then stick with us though, because we're going to move on to some just quick business, including some prizes and a session evaluation. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Candace Floyd, Ph.D. She's a tenured associate professor and vice chair for research in the Division of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at the University of Utah. She is also a scientist with the Salt Lake City VA healthcare system. She serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Neurotrauma and Neurotrauma Reports. Dr. Floyd currently serves on council for the National Neurotrauma Society and is the director of the Interagency Resource Center for Preclinical and TBI Research. She runs an active biomedical research program that conducts research on traumatic brain injury. Dr. Floyd serves on the board for Brain Injury Alliance of Utah, which is BIAU, and is a volunteer educator for the BIAU. We're really excited and honored to have her here speaking with us today. And so without further ado, we'd like to have her to just begin our first session of the morning of Family Links. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Colleen, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. So again, I'm Candace Floyd. I'm going to be talking about brain injury basics today. And quite a bit of this content was prepared by the Utah Brain Injury Council, which is a group of nonprofit organizations that seeks to educate Utahns about brain injury. And again, part of the hat that I'm wearing today is one of my volunteer activities with the Brain Injury Alliance of Utah. So I'm also going to tell you a little bit about that group. Sorry, my slide's going. I just want to take a pause at the beginning, and I'll remind you this at the end. So the Brain Injury Alliance of Utah, in conjunction with the Utah Department of Health and the Utah Traumatic Brain Injury Fund, are having a brain wellness fair on May 13th and 14th. We'd invite you all to come. It's going to be really fun. It's in Draper, Utah at the Slopes Event Center. So it's a free event, free parking. If you'd like to learn more about brain injury, there will be speakers talking about all aspects of brain wellness, talking about nutrition and mindfulness and ways to heal and ways to prevent brain injury. There will be booths about that have resources for brain injury. A kids fun zone will have games and lots of activities that are really fun and for learning about brains. Door prizes and opportunity drawings. And this year we're featuring dance as one of the kind of performance events to highlight dance and brain injury. And then we're really excited. We have a grant from Intermountain, so we will be able to give out bicycle helmets to everyone and have experts there that will fit the bicycle helmets to you or your kids or your family members so that you've got really good fit and protection. So everyone's invited. We'd love to have you and love to see you. So we're going to talk a little bit today about what is a brain injury. And we're going to talk about concussion versus brain injury, because you probably heard some of those words, and I'm going to try to clarify that for you. We'll talk a little bit about brain function, and then the impacts of brain injury on the individual and the family. Okay, so here's our first participatory event. So what I'd like you to do, I know you guys are mainly muted, so I want you to count it in your head. So I want you to count 23 seconds. Are you ready? Go, start. Are you done? Probably not yet. So why am I asking you to count 23 seconds? Because every 23 seconds, one person in the United States sustains a traumatic brain injury. And the severity of the brain injury at the time depends on a few things. And so kind of the outcome of the brain injury. Firstly, it depends on how long it takes for the person to receive attention, medical attention after the brain injury. That really affects the outcome. And really, at this time, the only cure for brain injury is prevention. So there are lots of ways to treat brain injury after the event occurs, but the best way to cure brain injury and not have results of the brain injury is preventing the injury to start. This is a really interesting quote, and I like it a lot. So it's from Caroline Rocco. She's a person that wrote a book called The Unvarnished Truth. There is no cure for brain injury. And she has a son with brain injury. And she commented that no brain injury is too mild to ignore or too severe to lose hope. And I think that really puts things in focus. First off, there's a continuum of brain injury from mild, moderate to severe. And each brain injury is individual, and the effects of it are individual. And we'll talk more about that. So what about Utah? So there are 67 Utahns per day who sustain a traumatic brain injury. That leads to over 22,000 Utahns who are treated and released from emergency departments for traumatic brain injury each year. There are around between 550 and 600 Utahns who die each year from a traumatic brain injury, and over 2,500 Utahns are hospitalized each year for a brain injury. Now, this to me is a very interesting statistic. 80% of Utahns who are hospitalized for something like skateboarding, rollerboarding, bicycle, or some snow sport, skiing or snowboarding, or people that were riding a ATV or off-road vehicle, and they were hospitalized for a TBI, were not wearing a helmet. People not wearing a helmet. It drives me crazy because I see people all over, kids too, right? All over Utah, riding bicycles, riding mopeds and scooters and things without wearing a helmet. And that one activity could reduce these brain injuries, right? 80% of those people aren't wearing a helmet. So in Utah, brain injury is a very prevalent problem. So let's talk about what are the leading causes of brain injury in Utah. Actually, falls is a large cause of brain injury. And it's typically in two different age groups, typically elderly persons and the very young. And what's interesting is that these are not falls off a roof often. So the epidemiology shows that these are falls from a standing height, right? And so someone might trip over a rug and fall, and the impact of that fall enables them to incur a brain injury. They incur a brain injury due to that impact. The second leading cause of brain injury in Utah are motor vehicle accidents. Motorcycle crashes are third. Assaults are fourth. And then sports and play accidents. And an estimated 90% of these are mild and unreported. I'm going to go back just a second to these numbers. So where do you think these numbers come from? These epidemiological numbers come from? And I know you can't answer because you're not going to turn on your mic. So I just want you to think about yourself. These numbers actually come from hospitalization records. So because these statistics come from hospitalization records, it's very likely that they underestimate the amount of brain injury in Utah, right? Because there are a lot of people, particularly people on the more mild spectrum of brain injury, that don't go to the emergency room after a brain injury, right? And so they're not reflected in these numbers. So it's likely that the brain injury numbers in Utah are maybe 2 or 3 times these numbers that are collected from hospitalizations. So, okay, I'm talking about a traumatic brain injury. What am I talking about? So a traumatic brain injury is caused by movement or impact of the brain such that the brain is disrupted. The brain activities are disrupted. So let's think about how this happens. And I'm going to kind of like give you an example here. So your brain floats. So your brain floats in cerebral spinal fluid. And that's great because that cerebral spinal fluid that surrounds your brain is kind of like a cushion, kind of like a shock absorber. So your brain floats, and then it's tethered at the base of the brain by the spinal fluid. So the adult brain weighs about 3 pounds. And throughout the base of the skull, there are bony prominences that protrude up through the skull. And they're small, but they separate out the different lobes. So when a person has a brain injury, so think about a person who falls from a bicycle, for example, not wearing a helmet, their brain rapidly shifts forward and backward right? That floating brain moves inside their skull. This is an example of how that might look. So a traumatic brain injury results from an external force. We talked about these from falls, accidents, physical abuse, sports injuries. So if you look at this picture here on the, I guess it's on your right-hand side of the slide, this is the idea that the brain is moving, it's floating, and it's moving within the skull. So you can see that this, the blue arrow at the base of this indicates the impact to the body. So the brain then moves, hits on this side when the person falls, and then it moves to the other side. So the brain is moving in the skull back and forth, causing injury in lots of different locations of the brain. This is called a coup contre coup injury. It could work in any direction. So here's an example of a motor vehicle crash where the person's head moves forward rapidly, accelerates, and then decelerates, and then moves back, causing mechanical injury, mechanical forces loading the brain that damage the fragile brain cells. There are other mechanisms of brain injury. So think about bruising to the brain. There could also be pressure to the brain, caused by a clot of some kind. Anoxia is a lack of oxygen to the brain. It's been well established, and I'm one of the researchers that worked in the beginning to understand this, but a blast injury, soldiers and military personnel, personnel who work in construction sites with blast, mining exposure to blast, things like that, can actually cause a brain injury as that blast wave moves through the person's brain. So essentially what happens is the mechanical damage then causes swelling, and it destroys the neurons in the brain. The neurons are actually the cells in our brains that communicate to one another and really comprise all of the brain's functioning. So you can think of it as a brain injury is like a storm, right? Like a big storm. So an analogy would be like a bunch of telephone poles down after a hurricane or a tornado. And so those individual cells now are unable to communicate with each other in the ways that they were able to do previously. And so they're not functioning in a network of communication as they were previously. And that can cause impairments associated with brain injury. So what are some of the risk factors for developing disability from brain injury? Brain injury is a major public health problem in the United States. So it's often called the silent epidemic because unlike other disabilities or some other disabilities, there often aren't outward signs of a person's changes after brain injury. And so many of the problems that result from a brain injury are not readily apparent, to us. So the person isn't often have motor impairments, or they don't, quote unquote, look any different than a neurotypical person. Oftentimes, a brain injury is frequently unidentified. And so, someone may not know that if they're acting differently, that it's because they had a brain injury. And appropriate treatment at the right time and the right dose and frequency is sometimes not readily available. And so that's one of the missions of the Brain Injury Alliance of Utah, is to provide everyone with information about brain injury. Not only folks like yourself, community members and family members, but we also train medical providers about brain injury so that everyone can receive the care that they need. So let's talk about this idea of a silent epidemic. So the effects of a brain injury are things like changing in thinking, changing in mood, right? Things like that, right? Things that your functions that your brain controls. So they might not be readily apparent to an outside observer. There might not be any facial marks or anything that would indicate that the person has had a brain injury. And then sometimes people would assume that there would be negative consequences, right? So if they're having problems concentrating or problems paying attention, or they're having emotional lability, we call it. So they're happy one minute and sad the next minute, and it might not be related to kind of the situations. So the negative consequences that can occur when the general public and medical providers don't recognize these, or that people could have problems at work or at school and performance. They could have changes in personal relationships, and people wouldn't understand that it's related to the brain injury. Legal problems, homelessness, houselessness, problems keeping jobs. So you can imagine there can be a lot of problems associated with brain injury, particularly if the brain injury individual and family members don't get help. Okay, so let's talk about acquired brain injury. So any injury to the brain that occurs after birth is classified medically as an acquired brain injury, right? So it occurs after birth, so it's acquired during that person's lifetime. And we've talked about that. That could be accidents, but it could also be things like tumors or strokes, infectious disease. So there's been some recent data suggesting that in certain cases, COVID led to anoxic brain injury or encephalitis. So acquired brain injury is the biggest kind of category of brain injury that it includes all brain injuries that occur after birth. Traumatic brain injury that we spoke about at the beginning, and I'll often call it TBI. So traumatic brain injury is a form of acquired brain injury, but there are other acquired brain injuries that aren't traumatic in nature, like we talked about a tumor or a COVID-based injury. So infectious disease, stroke are brain injuries also. They are acquired brain injuries because they occurred after birth, but they were not traumatic in nature, such as falls, vehicle accidents, and sports injuries. So when we think about brain injury, we typically think about a continuum of injury. And these words aren't the best words to describe brain injury, but they're the ones we have, and they're the ones that are used clinically. So there are three essential categories of brain injury, but again, these aren't discrete categories. This is a continuum. So we think about brain injury in terms of mild, moderate, and severe brain injury. So let's talk a little bit about these. So mild brain injury is typically classified or categorized by a brief or no loss of consciousness. So after the person has that impact to the head that we talked about, that loading of the force, maybe they fall or have their bicycle accident, they might lose consciousness for a short period of time, a few minutes perhaps, or they might not. In colloquial terms, sometimes people have called this, getting your bell rung, right? So there's like a short term of dissociation, possibly. There might be loss of memory for the events of the injury, like they might not exactly remember what happened. It's very common. And there might be that alteration in mental state. In moderate brain injury, there is typically a loss of consciousness. So the person is quote unquote knocked out, right, in colloquial terms. And that loss of consciousness can have a duration from minutes to hours. There often is confusion after the brain injury from days to weeks, including amnesia. The amnesia might be persistent or sporadic. So they might remember some things and not other things, and they typically won't remember exactly what happened around the event. And sometimes that's difficult for us to understand, right? Because we keep saying, well, what happened? Like, you've changed, what happened? And they're like, I don't know. And like, they literally don't know. They don't remember what happened often. There can be physical, cognitive, and behavioral impairments with moderate brain injury as well. We're going to talk a little bit more about those. Severe brain injury is classified by a prolonged unconsciousness or coma. There is typically pronounced amnesia for the events of injury. So this is typically like a more severe car accident or something like that could be in that regard. Other types of injury can cause severe brain injury. Penetrating injury also is typically more severe. And there's often permanent physical, behavioral, and cognitive impairment after brain injury. And so often the folks that have severe brain injury will need different types of assistance throughout the remainder of their lifetime. So again, I want you to remember that this is a continuum, right? So these are not unique or distinct components, but there's a continuum of symptoms from mild, moderate, and severe brain injury. And things that affect the symptoms include the pre-injury functioning, right? And also it includes the length of time that it took for the person to receive some treatment. So what determines the effects of a brain injury? One main factor is actually the number of brain injuries a person experiences. And this is really important, and it comes from a lot of different data sources. My research group contributed to this data as well. But the idea now is that 3 is a really important number to know. So what we know after multiple brain injuries, here it's after multiple concussions. Concussion is a mild brain injury. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. There is an association with developing problems in the brain, can be later in life, or it can be brain disorders that are typically associated with people older in life are developed younger. I'm going to give you an example. I worked with a young man in the state of Tennessee. This is before I moved to Utah. And he's just a bright young man. He started playing football as like a peewee football player. And he played football all through school. and very successfully. Actually, went to college on a football scholarship, and then his sophomore year, just things changed for him. So he wasn't able to control his emotions. He wasn't able to pay attention in school. He just wasn't able to relate to his family members. So he had some social skill changes. And it seemed to him like, this kind of happened overnight, but there wasn't an event that he or anyone could remember had occurred. And then it was later understood that he had had multiple concussions, probably through football and other of his sports activities through his developmental years. And then by the time he was in his early 20s, his brain was acting as if he were an elderly person with a lot of memory and impairments. So this is an example of how multiple brain injuries increase the risk of injury. And it essentially is that the brain loses its capacity to heal after multiple brain injuries, kind of each injury causing it to heal less. So this idea is that you've got the initial injury, and then the second injury increases your risk. And then by the third time you've got an injury, it's an 8 times greater risk for having long-term impairment than the first injury. So it's really important to think about ways to prevent and manage brain injury. So let's talk about concussion versus TBI. So the word concussion, and I've used it a lot in this talk already. People say, I hear this a lot, I didn't have a brain injury, I had a concussion. And I think that people say that, right? Clinically, they'll say that to people. They'll say that to kids participating in sports. It's okay, you just had a concussion. It wasn't a brain injury. Well, that's actually not true. That's a myth. So a concussion is a brain injury. So a concussion and a mild brain injury are the same thing. And so a concussion is a trauma-induced alteration in mental status. Again, the person might be dazed or confused or disoriented. There may not be loss of consciousness, right? But it's important because a concussion can result in loss of memory for the events, just like we talked about with mild brain injury. So again, there's this kind of myth that concussion is not brain injury, but a concussion is a brain injury. And then what's important is that most people, particularly kids, but most people after they have a concussion, with proper management, which we're going to talk about, and they do fine. Their brain recovers, right? But it's really important in the time periods, a few weeks, days or weeks after they've had a concussion, that they don't participate in those activities then that kind of led to the concussion. So they take a little bit of time out for their brain to heal, particularly for the reasons I just described to you. So what do you do for concussion? So the first thing you do, this is kind of what they call the ABCs of concussion. So you assess the situation. So I told you that brain injury is incurred by a mechanical loading of the brain in some way. So, right, the person could have fallen, it could have been a car accident, or I even told you that they could have been exposed to blast exposure, and that pressure wave moving through the brain could cause concussion. So assess a situation and think to yourself, did that person fall in a way where they might have hit their head? And if the answer is yes, then the next thing, the B, is be alert for brain injury signs and symptoms. I'm going to talk more about those, but do they seem dazed and confused? They're kind of a little out of it in colloquial terms. Are they understanding what's going on? Do they have memory loss? Are they having sensory deficits? And then if the answer is yes, contact a healthcare professional. So assess, be alert for brain injury signs and symptoms, and then contact a healthcare professional. So as we talked about when we talked about the epidemiology at the beginning, a lot of people don't seek medical attention for concussion, but they should, because a concussion is a brain injury and can be treated. So what are the signs and symptoms of concussion? So this is from the CDC, and that's really a great resource if you're interested in learning more about mild brain injury. The concussion website of the CDC is great, and it's really a good resource for schools and groups and troops. So if you needed some more information, it's a place I recommend, and it's at www.cdc.gov. So headache, dizziness, blurred vision. People say they're in a brain fog, is a colloquial way to describe difficulty thinking clearly. They can have sensitivity to noise or light. These are some typical signs of concussion. And oftentimes, like we talked about, these are not things you're going to see by looking at a person. These are things you need to talk to the person about to understand. And especially if you think about, goodness gracious, think about a teenager who, it's the night before the big game, right? Or the night before the big dance performance or something that they've been looking forward to participating in. and they fall and hit their head and they have these types of things, they might not be, communicating about these. They might not want to miss that big dance performance or that big cheerleading performance, but it's so important to be able to manage the brain injury. So you need to be looking out for these things. So if you think an athlete or a participant in some activity has a concussion, this is the heads up action plan developed by the CDC. So remove your student or the child or your family member or yourself from the activity. So remove the athlete from play, remove the dancer from performing. If you're at a bicycle rally, take your kid and your family out of the bicycle rally. And then keep the athlete at play at least for the day of the injury, right? And so give at least a day to analyze. And then typically you would obtain permission from an appropriate healthcare professional, get them cleared to return back to play. And there can be different ways this is done, but typically it's done by assessing their cognitive function. Imaging can help, although in mild brain injury, MRI imaging and CT imaging don't often diagnose a brain injury. So really you need to understand the mental status of the person, and your healthcare professionals can help with that. So in Utah, we have the Utah Concussion Law for schools. And it's about the protection of athletes with head injury act. So it's called, the Protection of Athletes with Head Injury Act. It was enacted in 2011. Excuse me. And it requires any amateur sports organization. So it could be, T-ball, it could be Pee Wee soccer, anything, right? Amateur sports organization to adopt and enforce a concussion and a head injury policy. And recently, actually last year in 2021, this has been expanded to all school activities. And so it could be the chess club or the debate team, or it could be anything that is a school activity. They need to be looking for concussion. It's a really great way to protect our kids in school. So in Utah, 3 students suffer a concussion each day at school. Like, that's remarkable, right? That 3 students each day suffer a concussion. And brain injury occurs from just looking at statistics. About 61% of the concussions are among male students. And so there is a kind of a male bias. Maybe that's, who knows why that is, but maybe that's because of activities. About 37% of concussions in schools happen during lunch, recess, or PE class, which maybe isn't surprising. And over half of concussions are reported at the beginnings of the school year, so September and October. Unclear why that occurs, but maybe it has to do with the newness of the school year. And about 80% of schools in Utah have required training for their staff about concussions. Of course, we would like that to be 100%, but this is, kind of the current state. And about 60% of schools in Utah require coaches or trainers to receive concussion materials. So this is an area where the Brain Injury Alliance of Utah can help. So we provide training like this. I have different kind of levels of training that I provide. Like I said, I'm a volunteer trainer for the Brain Injury Alliance of Utah, and I'm happy to come to school groups or troops or, Boy Scout troop or a team or anything like that and give a concussion training to the kids, the parents, and the supporters of that group. So this is the Utah Concussion Bill. It was the H Bill 204, but the basics of this Utah concussion law are that all organized amateur sports must have a concussion policy, must be given to the parents, and that if a concussion is suspected, the child can't return to play until they're cleared by a medical professional. And remember, I said it before, but I want to emphasize it again. A concussion is a mild brain injury, and having multiple mild brain injuries is associated with more severe impairments later in life. So it's really important. Might not seem like it at the time when you're in the heat of the moment, but it's really important for us to be managing concussions in our school kids. Okay, so I'm looking at the time. So I'm going to talk just a few minutes about brain and behavior. I kind of talked a little bit about this, but, and I promise, I do teach neuroanatomy in medical school, but I promise I will not spend too much time talking about neuroanatomy. But I want to just go over, your brain has different parts, and different parts of the brain have different functions. So if you think about it, when we think about a brain injury, as I told you, depending on how the brain moves, how the impact and the force loading on the brain is achieved or occurs, right? Depending on the direction of the fall, depending on the direction that the head was accelerated in the motor vehicle crash or whatever it was, the bicycle accident or whatever it was, different parts of the brain might be impacted. And the parts of the brain that receive that mechanical damage would then lead to the functional deficits or challenges that resulted from the brain injury. So the frontal lobe of the brain is what it sounds like. It's the part of the brain that's in the front. The frontal lobe is considered to be responsible for, or the functions that occur from the frontal lobe are movement, initiation of thinking, reasoning and judgment, control of behavior and emotions, memory and speaking. So you can imagine that a brain injury or a bruise of those neurons and cells on the frontal lobe could result in deficits in a lot of these very important functions that your brain does. The parietal lobe, this is the lobe that's on the side. It's orientation in space. So not just knowing right from left, but kind of knowing where your body is in space, called proprioception. Sensation, so a lot of feeling, reading, and understanding spatial relationships. The temporal lobe is associated with understanding language, behavior, memory, which is obviously really important for all of us, but important in school-age children, and hearing. The occipital lobe is responsible, that's the lobe here in the back, is responsible for vision, color blindness. The cerebellum is just a great structure. It's at the base of the skull. It's often injured in brain injury, and it results, injury to the cerebellum results in difficulties in balance, coordination, and fine motor control. And then the brainstem is the structure that's at the very base of the brain. And this is the very basic components that your brain controls, essentially, that keep us alive. So it's things about breathing, blood pressure, heartbeat, and swallowing. And so unfortunately, those brain injuries that result in death are typically have some component of the brainstem as well. So then what are the signs and symptoms of brain injury? Well, they're physical symptoms like we talked about, and they can be graded. So often persons with brain injury will have headache, and it can be post-traumatic headache is what it's called. It can be mild headache, mild persistent headache. It can be a tension type headache, it can be migraine type headache, can last. There are people that have had post-traumatic headache that have lasted for years and years and decades and decades. So it can be very interfering with their daily activities. Often people, especially acutely after injury, will have spells of dizziness, but it could be that dizziness will be a problem that they would go on to experience after the brain injury in the kind of subacute and chronic stages. Vision problems, we talked about the occipital lobe being in the back of the brain, particularly if a person has a head injury where they move their head forward and back. They can have problems with reading. A lot of times people report that the words tend to bounce on the pages and they can't focus. They can have some neglect of different sides. So it's like they're looking, but a part of the visual field falls out. They have visual neglect, and they just literally don't see that part. So their eyes work fine. It's the brain doesn't interpret from their eyes that part of the visual field. Decreased coordination, again, from the cerebellar damage. Seizures are very common after brain injury, and there are many people that develop post-traumatic epilepsy. And then sensory changes or loss. Again, a lot of times the sensory organ itself is working, but the integration of those signals, remember those telephone poles we talked about? The signals aren't getting through in the right way. So something that used to smell sweet might smell terrible now, or the same for taste. So learning and understanding, so folks will have difficulty with memory. That's really a big problem. But also trouble paying attention, right? So trouble with focusing on a thought. So they'll start a thought and they'll either forget what they were saying, or they'll forget what you were talking about, or they'll seem to be jumbled, right? They'll kind of jump from one thought to another, right? And so they'll have this kind of saltatory cognition where it's hard to understand what they're talking about because things aren't making sense in a linear fashion. And then really inability to remain on task, right? And you can imagine how that could affect schoolwork or work performance, or even doing things at home, where you leave a stove on because you forgot about it, things like that. And then the social aspects of brain injury are things that people don't often talk about, but they're very, very important. So a person could have difficulty attending to social cues. So there are examples of this, right? They might not, kind of our social cues for the amount of distance we would use if we're talking between two people, right? Like what's our kind of boundary, our personal boundary? Or when should we talk in a louder voice, or when should we talk in a more quiet voice, or when is it appropriate to laugh or not to laugh in a situation? Those types of things can be completely lost in a person with brain injury. A person with brain injury might also lose their self-identity or their self-image. They have to redefine that. They may not just feel like themselves anymore. They may feel angry at things that didn't make them angry or sad. There can be a lot of personality changes. And again, this emotional liability is a really common component after brain injury, where it seems like, anything will kind of set somebody off, something like that, right? And so people are like, oh my gosh, like you didn't used to be like this. Like now, you have a short fuse or something that didn't used to bother you, and now it bothers you all the time. Many stories. I worked with a family with brain injury where, the dad had a brain injury, and it was a large family, so they had 8 kids, and the dad had always been kind of like the one that everybody went to solve their problems. And after the brain injury, he didn't have that ability anymore. So it really changed the role in the family, as you can imagine. So, and then again, problems with emotional control. And so it can be inappropriate emotions, right? So feeling really sad in a happy time. It could be, an outburst that's, you think something's very funny when it's not a funny time. It could also be like flat affect, right? So the person just doesn't show joy, doesn't interact in ways that doesn't express their feelings of happiness and joy, doesn't interact in ways that build social bonds. Susceptibility to mood and anxiety disorders, that is a biological brain-based alterations, but it also can be a behavioral-based alterations from some of the other things we talked about, like loss of self-identity. And unfortunately, individuals with brain injury are at an increased risk of suicide. So it's really important to understand the social aspects of brain injury as well. And then egocentric behaviors are often common. So the person, the world of the brain injured person becomes centered around them and their desires. It's called being hypofrontal, right? So I always think about that in terms of, I want it now. And I don't care that you say we have to wait. Like I want it now. It's about me. It's about my wants. That's being egocentric. So what you can see is there is a constellation of symptoms after brain injury. And certainly not all brain injuries have these symptoms, and the constellation of symptoms varies. What makes it vary? Well, things we talked about. It varies based on the method of injury, right? How the brain received injury, how the mechanical loading was. It varies based on the person, their characteristics. There are probably genetic variations in the response to brain injury. It varies based on the time the person took to get medical care. Varies based on the treatment and the therapy to help them recover. So we think, particularly the Brain Injury Alliance of Utah, of brain injury as a very individualized component. So what are some general strategies? So I said it's very individualized, but here's some general strategies. How am I doing on time? You're still muted, Colleen, but.
Great. Thank you so much.
No worries.
You're doing perfect, but we are at that 10-minute mark
10 minutes. Perfect.
left before. So yeah, so 20 minutes left before the end of this session is complete, but everybody stick around. They'll be
we're good.
So
That's
yeah,
perfect.
doing great. Perfect.
So some general strategies. So as I said, really the best approach is an individualized, person-centered approach. And that's what we do at the Brain Injury Alliance of Utah. It's free, open to the public, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. But in general, there are some strategies that you could use. So a structured environment, right? So things without a lot of distractions, that can really help a person with brain injury focus, right? So noise levels. So oftentimes, like I have an example where after I was working with a group of teenage girls after they had brain injury, and I thought, oh, let's go to the movies. Like that would be great. And we get into the movie theater, and you know how loud movie theaters are, and then everybody is just not happy, right? Because it's so loud in the theater. So managing noise levels, and then managing the tasks in a place-specific way, right? So if you've got things to do at home, managing those, right, in that area, managing the school things, managing the workplace things, right? So things are compartmentalized into like smaller bites, so there can be more cognitive understanding of those. So breaking tasks into components. So, so you think, oh, okay, I'm going to need to do the laundry. So what's the first thing I need to do? Like persons that have neurotypical brain function would kind of just plan 4 or 5 steps in ahead and not maybe have to think about the intermediate steps or the smaller steps. But individuals that are having trouble attending to tasks or having trouble remembering the orders of tasks, right, after their brain injury, having them in small defined components might help. And then the other thing is the brain now is injured. It's spending a lot of its energy in recovering and repairing itself. And so the person will feel fatigue, brain fatigue, physical fatigue. They might just get tired. They might have, like I said, this terrible headache that's interfering with their ability to concentrate. Help develop organizational systems, note-taking, reminders. You can use, there's lots of technologies and apps to remind us to do things, right? Orders of things to help lay things out, lay the clothing out the day before. But really the important thing is being consistent. So a lot of changes in the system, a lot of changes in the expectations don't help the person with brain injury in understanding how to participate with the challenges that they're experiencing in their brain. So I mentioned this, I'll mention it again. Just wanted to invite you all, everyone here, to the Brain Wellness Fair, where we have lots of speakers, booths, like I said, kid fun zones, dance performances. I think it'll be really fun. So, okay, so what do you do next? So if you're interested in learning more about brain injury, I kind of mentioned this in the talk, but the Brain Injury Alliance of Utah is a nonprofit organization. I'm a volunteer. There's several volunteers that work with the Brain Injury Alliance of Utah. The main goals of the Brain Injury Alliance of Utah are to provide person-centered, individualized resource facilitation. So that's free of charge. So how do you get that? How does someone get that? If you know someone with a brain injury, have a family member with a brain injury, you just call the Brain Injury Alliance of Utah. You can also, our website's here. You can also leave a message on the website. And then usually within a day or two, we try to get back to everybody in a day. It doesn't always happen, but someone will call you back. So we have professional brain injury professionals, social workers, and other brain injury resource facilitators. They will talk to the individual with brain injury or the family members, figure out what are the areas that are needing the most improvement, what are the goals, and then they will work on a resource plan to help you reach those goals. So everything is free, open to the public, right? Just have to be a person who lives in Utah. The other thing that we do is education. So a lot like this session, I teach to school children. Again, I told you I teach to coaches, schools, troops, professionals. If you're interested in having, some organization you're involved with, learn more about brain injury, I'm happy to come and give a talk either in person or in Zoom. We have a lot of other resources. So on our website, we have a lot of resources as well to learn more about brain injury. So what are some other resources in the state of Utah? So the Utah Department of Health has a really nice brain injury website. It's run through the Violence Injury Prevention Program. And they have, there's a state funded program in Utah called the Utah Traumatic Brain Injury Fund. And so this is a state fund where it's what they call payer of last resort. So if there are persons that have a brain injury and you need help, medical assistance or imaging or some kind of diagnostic assistance, the Utah Traumatic Brain Injury Fund can provide funds for those people to receive help if they don't have another way to pay. And so the Brain Injury Alliance of Utah can also enroll people in the Utah State Traumatic Brain Injury Fund and can guide people through that process. The Brain Injury Alliance of Utah also works with like Department of Persons with Disabilities and other state departments to help coordinate care. So I think I finished on time, hopefully. I just want to say thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions or any discussion things you might think of.
You're incredible. This has been super, super great. I actually, I have a varsity lacrosse player, and this has got me thinking about all kinds of crazy stuff that I hadn't before. I'm always thinking about my daughter with autism and all those kinds of things, but now I'm going like, oh man, my athletes, my soccer player, my lacrosse player, and all of their peers and things like, I'm definitely keeping this recording for
and that's great. And I just want to emphasize, so I always joke around that I could run if someone were chasing me. Like I myself am not a well-accomplished athlete, but I did play, sports all the way through school. I was like a softball player and volleyball player and things like that. And so there's so many great aspects about having kids participate in sports. I mean, there's so many wonderful aspects about that. Same with dance, same with cheerleading, same with all of these aspects. So I don't want you to think that I'm saying to you, don't have your kids participate. What we are saying is have your kids participate, but be aware about brain injury, and be aware about the consequence, especially concussion, right? It's a brain injury, so be aware. So that's one of the things that the Brain Injury Alliance of Utah would like to help teams and groups do is participate. It's great. Like, let's do it. Let's all have great fun, but also be aware so that we'll be able to manage those brain injuries and prevent and manage.
And we did have a mom that made a great comment. You know what I mean? That some of these things do require us to be aware. You know what I mean? Like this mom said she was aware that it wasn't just her being, mommy paranoid or things like that, that she was aware and she did have some of these, some of this knowledge, and that helped her to further help her kids. But so real quick, we do have 10 minutes left before the end of the session. So on behalf of the Family Links Committee, we want to thank everyone, but especially our presenter for this information and for the informative session and just all of this wonderful content that you provided. We really couldn't be here without you. And also, you'll probably see a little pop-up. So we always love to hear from our audience what was helpful about the session, what we're doing well, what we can improve upon. We'll have a couple more opportunities to do these conferences. And so if you can take a minute to fill it out, this information is anonymous, but just the results get shared with the presenters and with the Family Links Committee. So please, that we also, don't forget that our in-person Family Links event will take place on the morning of Saturday, May 14th. And we'll be having a keynote and everything. Also, we have a winner. We have prizes. Isn't that fun? So we have, if Mindy Moon, you win. Oh, you win a $20 Amazon gift card from our sponsor, the Autism Council of Utah. So if you will either put in, if you know how to direct message the UPC Zoom, or you can email into us as well, your address, your mailing address, or your email, we can get in contact with you to get you that prize. Congratulations.
Colleen, do we have time to answer a couple of questions?
We sure do. We have 10 minutes. Yep, we still have 10 minutes for that. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to pull them up then. I saw a question. I scanned them quickly. Maybe Colleen can help me.
Yeah.
But I saw a question about frontal temporal dementia and what could cause that. So any of those types of, so I hope that person's still on, and I'm happy to answer more questions about it if you wanted to come live. But any of those types of dementias are typically caused by neural degeneration. So neural degeneration is a type of brain injury, acquired brain injury. There are lots of things that can cause it. It could be brain injury, could have caused it, traumatic brain injury like we talked about. It could be genetic. There could be a toxic exposure that caused it. But essentially what happens is the cells in a particular region of the brain release neurochemicals. And those neurochemicals, instead of signaling as they would do normally, so one of the main neurochemical categories that the neurons release are called excitatory amino acids. Excitatory amino acids, and the main one of those is glutamate. And so when glutamate is released in the brain, in a neurotypical brain, it's released in a very tight connection, synaptic connection. So one cell releases it, another cell receives it, and it causes signaling between the two cells. However, in degeneration, what happens is those connections, the cells either die off, so then one cell's releasing and the receiving cell is no longer there. So then the glutamate expands and it affects other cells. And when it does that, it causes death of those other cells. So think about a tissue that is slowly degenerating because it's losing cells, and that loss of cells then kind of leads to other loss, So there are lots of other mechanisms of degeneration, but excitatory neurotransmitter-based degeneration is one of the main ones. And that's one of the main kind of underlying pathological components of that type of dementia. So there are medications, you know this already, because you've probably already gone through medical. There are medications that can slow that kind of expanse, right? But they can't reverse it. And so they essentially are, I'm going to call them MOPs of glutamate, which isn't exactly the pharmacology, but they essentially can absorb some of the excess glutamate or stop that glutamate from release, and they can kind of slow the progression of the disease. Did that answer your question about the frontal dementia?
Yeah, I think that she had.
Okay.
I'm still on here. Thank
Oh, good,
you.
Diana.
Okay.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
Yes, I'm still on.
I was like, well, then sorry, I gave everyone else a.
No. Thank you for
great
that. I appreciate that input. It's hard because he's in California and
Yeah.
we're in Utah, and all we do is get bad reports on him, and
Yeah.
it just seems to be getting worse and progressing worse. So I was just curious.
Yeah, and the frontal stuff is kind of what we talked about. So it's going to be things that are hyperfrontal is going to be things that affect behavior, right? So they're probably, I'm guessing that a lot of the impairments are related to emotional liability and behavior,
outbursts. Yes, they're all behavioral. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So I do think that I'd be happy if you email. I can try to find. I don't know the California support systems as well as I do the Utah ones, of course, but I'm sure that there are also support systems in California that can help with, like support groups and working groups that can help family members. But you're right. I think from the perspective of you guys as a family, it's so hard to do, right? Like
it is
just to be like, it's the brain injury. You know what I mean? Like,
and you explained it very well, because I was assuming this was from an injury. I don't know. This is my brother-in-law. I didn't know him younger, so I don't know what his lifestyles were like, but it just seems when he turned 60, it just turned a different road. And wow. And he's had it now for 5 years, and we're just scared because they keep telling us this is like the end phase of, what he's in.
Yeah.
And it's just scary and sad.
Yeah. And I'm sorry to hear that. I really am.
Yeah.
And so unfortunately, they're not actually my laboratory's specialty is repair and regeneration strategies after brain
Wow.
injury. So I'm one of the handful of scientists in the world that kind of works on those.
Yeah.
I will tell you, we've been working on these types of strategies for over 20 years, and we've made a lot of progress, but I don't have anything in the clinic yet. So I've got some things that are close.
Thank you.
But at this time, you're right. The medications for this slow the progression of the disease, but they don't repair. And so unfortunately, you are looking at this path.
It is. It's very sad. It's just we are actually thinking of moving him to Utah so I could take care of him, because our son is disabled also.
Gotcha.
So, and his uncle and him, they're on the same level. It's so sad because our son is 16, but they get along so well. So we are considering that. So it's nice to know that there are these resources out here.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Thank you
And
for
we would be
informing us.
happy. There's really great state resources in Utah. It's one of the great things that Utah has done for this. And so, and in some ways, as we talked about, I know I'm almost out of time, but I'll be quick. Having that support system with you guys there and with your son, and you guys already having some things in place might really help him a lot.
That's what we're thinking. Thank you for taking this time to talk to me. I appreciate it.
And then just the last thing, if you could pop up that event flyer. Also, if we can get a copy of that, we'll just attach it to your page on our Family Links site on our Utah Parent Center website for people. Yeah. And they also, it doesn't have a time. Is there a specific time that you're holding?
Yeah, I'll send you guys a full flyer, but essentially on Friday from like 9 to 4 and Saturday 9 to 2. So
perfect. How fun.
Yeah, we'd love to have you. Yeah.
Thanks again, everyone. We were really excited to have you. It's been a really great start to the day. Thank you so much, Candace. We appreciate everything.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it. Have a
great day.